Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, WRAL's Debra Morgan. In today's conversation with WRAL podcast host Amanda Lamb, we're going to be talking about WRAL's newest podcast, The Killing Month, August 1978.
In the late 70s, three brothers built a vast criminal enterprise based on a sacred bond.
In their 10 commandments, there was only one, and that is, you don't rat us out or we'll kill you.
When a gang member snitched, they were shot and buried.
He had dirt under his fingernails, like he had tried to dig his way out.
But in August 1978, the Johnston brothers got wind that the people who were about to turn on them weren't just fellow gang members. They were family.
Put the gun right in the back of his stepson's head and put a contract out on your own son.
In hindsight, it was believable, but you had to believe the strange basic premise. What would happen if a father resolved that he would kill his own kids if it would keep him out of jail?
They're evil. As a kid, I didn't know it, but they are evil.
The Killing Month, August 1978, is the new podcast from WRAL.
Amanda, it's so nice to be on this side of the microphone and interviewing you for a change.
It's great to be interviewed. Thank you, Deborah, for doing this.
Talk about this podcast. How did you come up with the idea?
You know, we're always brainstorming ideas for podcasts. And of course, they are national. They are not local. They could be a local story or they could be a national story or, from somewhere else. But I had lived this story. I grew up in Pennsylvania. My dad was the district attorney at the time in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which was a place not that different from North Carolina. It was pretty rural at that time, about an hour outside of Philadelphia. And I just vividly remember this story. And just to give a little bit of the background, it was a family, three brothers, who were kind of outlaws, if you will. Some people called them a country mafia. And they were thieves. They stole things for a living. They stole tractors. They stole art. They stole antiques. They stole cars. They stole money. And they got away with it for a very long time. And eventually, some people started snitching on them to the police when they got caught. And specifically, some of these were younger members of the gang. Some of them were nephews. Some of them were stepsons. There was the son of the ringleader. And as their empire started to crumble because they thought they were going to be found out, these people started to die. The snitches, the witnesses started to die. And that's the story that we're telling. And it's very compelling. It's very old school. It's 1978. So you didn't have all the tricks of the trade that, investigators have today, like GPS and text messaging and all that stuff. They had to really, do it on the ground, boots on the ground kind of investigation. So it just always stuck with me. It happened when I was 12. I went to the trials, and it always stuck with me.
I feel like rarely do we ever get to do stories, podcasts that are so personal. This one, like you said, your father was the prosecutor. You remember these guys growing up. It was very close to home, literally and figuratively.
Absolutely. And I think that's what is so beautiful about podcasting. The genre allows us to be journalists, but also to delve into some I would say intimate areas where we're sharing things about our lives. We're sharing people's emotions. And we can do that in a different way than we can do it in television. We just have this breadth or this depth that we can share. And so that's why this was so awesome to be able to work on something very personal, but also something that I think is really a compelling story.
It definitely was compelling for me. I could not stop listening to it. I just went episode after episode. And, I was thinking, too, we have small towns here in North Carolina. So I think a lot of people can relate to this place where crimes like this happen, criminals like this. It can be all-consuming for the town.
Absolutely. And, like I said, where I grew up is not that different from North Carolina. I grew up in a suburb, but at the time, 1978, it was very rural still. Pennsylvania is made up of farmlands, just like North Carolina. And so I think that it was a place where people didn't lock their doors. They didn't worry about, crime. They didn't worry about violence. And so when this happened, they were so shocked. And I think, again, like you said, the people who are from small towns in North Carolina are really going to relate to this, especially people from, my generation who remember kind of this idyllic American lifestyle where we didn't worry about a lot of the things that we worry about today.
That was me growing up. We didn't lock our front door.
Yeah. I mean, it was a different time.
Yeah,
It was a
for
different
sure.
time.
Well, what struck me about this podcast was how it's a real lesson about family, including you and your father. So when we come back after the break, we're going to talk more about that. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Debra Morgan here with WRAL's Amanda Lamb. Amanda, we're talking about The Killing Month, August 1978, your newest podcast. And what struck me was not only how young some of these victims were, but also the callousness of not caring even if your own family lives or dies.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line with this family, the Johnston brothers, also known as the Johnston Gang, was that you couldn't do anything wrong except snitch. In other words, you can do anything you want, but if you snitch on them, you were likely to have a bullet to your head. And they didn't care who got in their way. If somebody got in their way, whether it was the son of the ringleader, whether it was nephews, stepsons, and a lot of these folks were teenagers when they were killed. They took them out. And so that's what was so incredible about this story. And so many people, even today, thinking about this from 45 years ago, the investigators said they just could never wrap their heads around the fact that it didn't matter who you were or how you were connected. If you were connected by blood to these people, they were going to kill you if they thought you were going to give them up to police.
You talked to so many people, journalists, investigators, some of the people involved in the gang themselves. Are you surprised at how perfect memories a lot of people had 45 years later?
Yeah, I really was. I mean, a lot of these people, my dad's 83. A lot of the people are in their 80s or 70s. And yet this was so defining to their lives. It became the narrative of so many people's lives. I mean, even, we talked to a snitch. We talked to a daughter of one of the victims who was 3 when her dad died. And yet this story completely defined her life and still does to this day. We talked to a witness who was basically a woman who worked at a hotel and had a very minor part in the case, but she could never let it go. So I think it was such a unusual case. It was so outrageous that all the people who were involved, even though they went on to, many of them have really illustrious careers, they remembered this so well and were able to recall so many details that were just unbelievable.
I was really surprised by that because you could hear it in their voices when they're being interviewed for your podcast, that they still feel what happened 45 years ago, not just think about it. They feel it.
Yeah, especially former state police officer Tom Cloud. He's a religious man. He got into law enforcement because he really wanted to help people. He cares about people. And he just could never get over the fact that some of these people who were killed, some of these witnesses, were teenagers that he had arrested and taken to, juvenile detention. And he remembered talking to them on those car rides and saying, hey, you got to get your life straight. You got to turn your life around. You have potential. And then to literally be the person digging up their bodies was so difficult for him.
Yeah, that's hard to forget for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you talk about your father a lot in this since he was the prosecutor in this massive case. So what was it like interviewing your father?
Oh, gosh. It was such an honor, Deborah. I mean, I've always been proud of my dad, and I always knew that he was sharp. He was a great attorney. And I watched him in the courtroom as a child. I think at that time, of course, I didn't think at 13 and 14 years old that I wanted to be a reporter. But it certainly had an impact on me because I remember thinking that, an investigation is all about facts, but then the courtroom has a lot to do with theater. And I remember watching him and just being so impressed by how he was able to relate these facts to the jury in a way that really touched people and made a difference. But I don't think I really understood what he did until we did this project. He had recently downsized and he said, oh, I've got all these notes from the trial. Would you like them? And in my mind, I'd always thought, well, maybe I'll do something on this because I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. one of the people who is in the podcast, Bruce Mowdy, was the local reporter for the Daily News at the time. He wrote a book called Jailing the Johnston Gang. So I thought, I don't really think I'm going to write a book. There's already a book, and there was actually a movie At Close Range with Sean Penn and Christopher Walken. So I never really knew what I was going to do with it, and I took the notes thinking, well, maybe someday. Well, of course, none of us could have envisioned podcasting, right? I mean, nobody had ever heard of it 10 years ago, or at least I hadn't. And so it really made sense to put this together. But as we worked on this, I mean, we emailed, we called. I would call him with little questions, and then he would, tell me new stories that I hadn't heard before. So we had a lot of contact. He still lives in Pennsylvania. But I really feel like we developed a new relationship,
As
a
adults.
rapport. Yeah. And he always used to joke that when I was growing up, I was Bill Lamb's daughter. And he then would come to North Carolina and he would be Amanda Lamb's father because he would meet people and say, my daughter's Amanda Lamb. And they'd say, oh, she's on WRAL. So I will say that the feeling that I got from working on this podcast was I've never been so proud to be Bill Lamb's daughter. So it's just been really amazing.
At the end of the podcast, because y'all have to get to the end of the podcast, it really brought tears to my eyes. Not to give anything away, but the podcast has such personal touches that you share. And I was so moved, especially as someone who no longer has her father, about how this podcast brought you and your father together in a way that's just so special. I mean, he did Take Your Daughter to Work Day before there was a Take Your Daughter to Work Day, and you all became so close.
I think, it's interesting because I'm sure some people would question why would you take your daughter to a murder trial. But remember, back then we had 3 TV channels. We had no internet. Everything I learned and knew came from books, really, and maybe some movies. And so this was an opportunity to really see my dad at work, and that's what he wanted me to see. And it really did stick with me. And I do share some of the memories that I have. And some of them were incorrect. I mean, I was able to learn throughout this as I talked to people, well, this is what I heard. No, that wasn't right, or that wasn't true. Or no, it didn't happen on this day, it happened on that day. But I did have a lot of really vivid memories that were accurate. And, I never for a moment questioned his decision to take me to court. I thought that was perfectly normal. I'm in the back working on my chemistry assignment, during a murder trial. And I do think it just helped shape me as a person to really get to know what my dad did, but also to see this very important thing, which is how the criminal justice system works. And of course, I've been a crime reporter for most of my television career, and I've written, true crime books, and so I have immersed myself from a different perspective into his world. But yes, I mean, it really has been an honor and a pleasure to work with him and to work with all of the other people who gave their time to us so graciously and then continued to. I mean, months of questions. We spent a year on this.
Wow.
So lots and lots of questions. But, and they all just graciously gave their time to us. But yeah, it's been an honor. I mean, if I never did another podcast, I'm thrilled that I got to do this one because I feel like it's a really compelling story that people are going to be interested in.
It is fabulous. It's so interesting and very compelling, as you said. What do you hope that people get out of it?
We talked a lot about this, my producer and I, Rachel, as we wrote the outline for the podcast. And I think a big part of it is that we are so shaped by the families that we come from, right? Mm-hmm. I grew up about a half an hour from where this happened, and I had a totally different life. I worked, I went to school, I was, angled towards going to college and having a career and working hard, doing the right thing, and some of the kids in this story, or all of the kids in this story, who were not that much older than I was, they had such a different experience. They didn't have mentors. They didn't have people to love them and nurture them and support them and help them get to, a successful place in life. And so I think that I was struck by that. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And then I just think people love a good mystery,
Yes,
right? I mean, this story has so many twists and turns.
It does.
And it's really phenomenal that most of it happened in this 1 month, August 1978. And, we work backwards. We start at the end, and then we tell you everything that led up to it. And the fact that these investigators with no DNA, none of the stuff we have today, were able to put this case together and get it to a courtroom was pretty amazing.
Old-fashioned police work.
Exactly.
I know your dad is going to be so proud of you when this podcast comes out in full. Has he heard it yet?
He has. So he has heard most of it at this point, and he said, and I thought this was really interesting, he said, I'm learning so much I didn't know. Because when you think about it, the prosecutor is the big, he's the big person overseeing the whole case. Right. So he's not going to know every detail. He also worked with an assistant district attorney, Dolores Troiani. She's in the podcast. She was amazing. She was one of very few women who were prosecuting violent crimes back at that time. And she was, just a rock star. But so she put a lot of this case together. But, the bottom line is it's one of those cases, I think, that it's just really hard for anybody to forget. And I think that people will definitely be fascinated by it.
Well, I certainly was. I know that people will be. And Amanda, thanks so much for your time and all the energy and everything that you put into this podcast, because it really is great.
Well, thank you, Debra, for switching chairs with me today. I appreciate it.
It has been great. And this has been the WRAL Daily Download, a production of WRAL News. You can find The Killing Month, August 1978, on WRAL Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It is now available on every platform. You might also want to check our other true crime podcasts, including What Remains, which focuses on solving cold cases with forensic science, and Follow the Truth, which is about the murder of Michael Jordan's father in North Carolina in 1993. Thank you for listening.